Hi, everybody. I'm with Rick Chavolla with the American Indian Community House here in New York City, and he's going to tell you all about the project, about the community house and what you do and where it came from.
Well, it's actually a good time to be talking about it because we're about to have our 50-year anniversary. We were founded in 1969, and it came about for a number of reasons. There was a long-time community of Indigenous folks here in New York, and of course, we're on Indigenous land, and I always give acknowledgments and blessings and thanks to the Lenape people whose land we're on. And so from the very beginning, there's always been Indigenous community and life here in New York City. And then the more modern part of that is that throughout the 20th century, a lot of Indigenous folks came to work here, and in particular, Haudenosaunee people. And some people know sort of the fabled Mohawk ironworkers who would work, high in the skyscrapers, and they were some of our founders. Because over time, even though at one time people don't know this, but there was a community in Brooklyn of Mohawk ironworkers and many other Indigenous people who found that to be a place where they could come and form community here in New York City. There was never an official center, and I think it's mostly because centers weren't as much a concept among Indigenous people. We thought of more in terms of community and being together in ways that we were sort of organically and naturally together. As opposed to saying, well, let's put together a nonprofit agency, that we call a center. But then centers started coming up throughout the United States, and it was part of, I think, an activist movement, the American Indian movement, who were some of our founders as well. So there were a number of centers that were being formed throughout the country during the 60s, both to provide services, but also to bring together Native people, Indigenous people, to think about what we need to be doing in terms of expressing our culture, our sovereignty, our rights, and so the combination of these things, the need for community and also the need to really find a place to express culture, to come together and really work towards our rights, is how the community house came together. So it was formed in that way, and from that time on, really, it's had the same mission. And the big part of the community house, in terms of the work it's doing, is that it be sovereign and self-determined by Indigenous people. So it was founded by Indigenous people. It's staffed by Indigenous people. The board is composed and always has been entirely by Indigenous people. And so it was a way in which we really could decide among ourselves how we wanted to live our lives here in New York City and what we wanted to do. And it's stayed the same all these near 50 years, and we still provide direct services. So if people are having difficulties in one way or another, or they have ideas about how they want to just grow and become stronger, we try to find ways to to really address those kinds of wishes and needs of the Indigenous community here in New York City.
Awesome. So how are you interacting with the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues for Indigenous Peoples? How is that going this week?
It's going really well, and we kind of do it in sort of in different ways. There's sort of an ongoing desire on our part to bring the experience of urban Indigenous people more to the notice of the UN, because sometimes that's not something that is as well known, and there's not as much discussion around Indigenous people in urban areas. It tends, like, this year's is around land and land rights, so the focus tends to be on our original lands, as it should be, and we find that also to always be of primary importance, because we are land-based, we are place-based, but we also want to make sure that included in the discussion somewhere is the fact that we oftentimes, through necessity or through choice, decide to move into urban areas, and we try to continue our life as Indigenous people in those urban areas. So that's one thing we kind of like to bring to to the United Nations. The other is we're always in solidarity with our nations, with our indigenous nations throughout, in this case, throughout the U.S. mostly, although we certainly try to connect internationally as well with, our sisters and brothers in Canada and, throughout Latin America and so forth. But a lot of our solidarity work is in what's now the colonial U.S. And we do solidarity work both because we have people who are part of our community here in New York who are from those indigenous nations, and also just because we feel it's important as a New York-based Indian center to be connected beyond New York City, because we know New York City in many ways has an impact on indigenous land throughout the world, really. And so that's part of what we try to do too, is take responsibility as New Yorkers to understand how New York City may impact the indigenous land and nations, outside of New York City. So, for instance, we sent a large contingent and supplies to Standing Rock during the No DAPL water protector resistance movement, and that was both because we had members of our community here in New York who were from there and now live in New York City, and also just because as indigenous people we need to have solidarity with our people, wherever they may be, and particularly around critical issues like that. And then we're also doing solidarity work with people in Bears Ears who are trying to protect the sacred lands and sacred mountain of Bears Ears. And that's also because we have folks who come from those areas, and because we've spent time out there, and I've gone out there myself, and I'm originally from the Southwest, so we have that connection there. And so to tie it to the UN, the Bears Ears community, and the 5 tribal nations who have come together around protecting Bears Ears are here at the United Nations for the Permanent Forum, and we've been trying to provide, again, support and solidarity with them. And we even have some side events that we've done in connection with Bears Ears. So that's the kind of work we've been doing here at the UN.
Wonderful. How about for United Methodist Church, Northeast jurisdiction? We're here. A lot of us are actually in New York or near New York.
Sure.
How can we interact or support or be allies? Concrete steps, or even, prayer is great, but what other ideas do you have for us?
Well, certainly, there's already a connection. One of your leaders is also a leader with us. Cindy Kent is on our board. And so one of the best ways to form a connection between United Methodists and the indigenous community, and maybe more specifically the community house, is by having people who bridge that, who bridge those two entities, if you will. And Cindy's a great example of that. She's, I know, very well respected in the United Methodists, and certainly very well respected in our community, and sits on our board and is one of our leaders. So that's one of the best ways to do it. The other is just to find ways to engage, find places where we intersect in terms of our goals, or our just what we feel is important, and find ways in which we can come together around those things. And I know that Cindy was talking to me about a meeting you're having in New York, and that you want to have an opening welcome from an indigenous person. And those kinds of things are really important to us, that any of the entities that may not be indigenous founded or sort of indigenous majority, that they also recognize and acknowledge the land as indigenous. And we feel that is such a crucial first step, because it's recognizing at the core core that you are on indigenous land, and that you have an indigenous person who opens whatever you're doing. And if you can't do that, you at least have the acknowledgement at every meeting, at every program, at every service, that we are in fact on indigenous land, and you give thanks and prayers to the indigenous people and nation on which you're on. And that, right from the beginning, reframes everything. And it really is a big gesture of support to the Indigenous community to start that way, because it reframes every discussion after that. And then from there, just finding all kinds of other ways to, as we say, indigenize your institution. So some of it is us coming together around things, but it's also the internal operations of, say, the United Methodists, finding ways that they can indigenize their institution. And we work with institutions around how to do that. And it's an ongoing process. And so when you do that, you start to notice that you think differently about things, you do things differently, you expand the way in which your congregation sees itself and thinks about how it'll work for the future. So
Yes, lovely. Thank you so much for taking time for me.
sure.
Okay.
Thank you.